Gluten-Tag. Imagine you could extract all the knowledge of professional bakers from hours of interviews and put that into a single video. That's exactly what this video is about. Be prepared for awesome tips from the baking pros to take your bread to another level. Stay tuned and have some fun. In the last year, I interviewed so many different baking pros, and all of them know probably 10 times as much as I do about baking bread. Now the videos have all been around 1.5 hours in total, and I figured to make it a little bit more comfy for you, I'm going to be extracting the best parts from all of the videos. The moments that helped me to become a better baker. Please enjoy. I was chatting with Carl. He and his company have stored more than 100 different sourdough starters. Carl is also known as the sourdough librarian. His goal is to store all the different sourdough starters and their unique properties from all around the world. The interview has been super eye-opening. I'm going to be linking the full interview right here. Now, I've been asking him about sticky dough. If you're a sourdough baker, then you might have experienced that before. You're working your dough, it's all good, and suddenly it turns into a very sticky mess. And I wanted to know the reason about this, and that's exactly what I asked Carl.
The gluten network is like a balloon. When these proteins that are present in the flour, they start to bind and they create the balloon that is retaining the gas that is produced by the yeast. But when on the other hand, the lactic acid bacteria, they consume this gluten network, so your balloon is getting holes and you can blow air inside to keep that balloon growing. But if the holes become too big and your gas production is getting too low, then your balloon deflates, and that's when the bread is what we call overproofed. And then you have, it's misery in the house, then you can make pizzas out of it.
So is that actually a bad thing, that the bread is overproofed? It won't retain its structure, but it should still be good to be baked inside a loaf pan, for instance, or?
Yeah, but still, when the bread is starting to collapse, it's not pleasant to eat it anymore, Nigel,
Okay.
because your crumb texture will not be nice. And no, it's
Okay.
Everything has its optimal, and it
Okay.
should be consumed within that range.
Next up is Jim Challenger. Jim has developed the Challenger bread pan. That's a really innovative Dutch oven for baking sourdough at home very, very easily. Now, what I noticed in my experiments was that sometimes when I would preheat my Dutch oven for a too hot temperature, then my bread wouldn't simply open up as much in the oven. I would have less oven spring. And now, since he developed the Challenger bread pan, I figured I best ask him directly. So what I pretty much did is, on the left-hand side, I was baking it at a hotter temperature. And on the right-hand side, I was baking it at a lower temperature. And I would be curious to know what your thoughts are on how to best use the bread pan.
Boy, it's a good question. I actually just kind of did that experiment, but only one time recently. I haven't done it for a while. So I think the jury's out. I did some reading on it, and it seems that you can almost bake bread at any temperature, and it kind of depends what you're looking for.
Okay.
So I read on one website that if you bake it lower and slower, you'll get a thinner crust. And so I haven't experimented with that. I mean, anybody online here probably knows the world of learning to bake bread is about experiments, and I probably have a list about this long of experiments I want to do. So it's on as an experiment. So what did you decide? So like I said, I only did it once recently.
And yeah, I mean, if you just look at your Instagram channel, those are just some of the amazing breads that Jim is baking. I mean, seriously, every bread that Jim is doing looks like that, and I wish my breads would look like that. So I'm wondering, to get a bread like this, what do you do? Which temperature are you opting for? Which technique are you opting for?
That bread is probably, I preheat the pan to 500. I think that's 260 Celsius. And then I turn my pan, the minute I load my bread, I turn it down to 500, or I turn it down to 425 Fahrenheit. So yeah, right about 216, 220.
Wow. Okay, so that's relatively low. Yep.
But the pan stays hot, and I'd like to actually do an experiment with a remote thermometer that I have for barbecue to see how long the pan stays hot if I put it under the loaf of bread. But because of the thick cast iron, it stays hot long enough. And so I've just played with that second temperature a lot and kind of like the way my loaves come out. But I'm really curious about that comment that said lower temperatures will give you thinner crust. I've asked a lot of bakers who say that, boy, I got a thin crust. I'm like, well, what did you do different? No one seemed to really know. I think that's kind of the fun thing about sourdough is no one really knows. There's lots of people, but the whole world of sourdough, I think, is advancing right now astronomically. And so, no one knows all these answers. It's up for all of us.
Now back to Carl, the master of fermentation. When you ferment your dough, you typically have a bulk of different doughs. That's why this stage is called the bulk fermentation. It happens after you add your sourdough starter to it. And it's always very hard to know when exactly this stage of the fermentation is done. And that's exactly what I wanted to know from Carl. And check out his interesting opinion on this topic.
If there is one thing I can say about sourdough, is that and what we've seen here in this library, is that each sourdough is unique. There is not two sourdoughs here that have the same constellation, that have the same consortium of microorganisms. There is many strains of yeasts that are present in the sourdoughs. Some of them is the typical, the most present one is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the baker's yeast. But there is so many variations within that species, like saying it's a dog, but you don't know if it's a poodle or if it's a German shepherd, okay? And so defining when is in time, that's already impossible. So you have to feel that. When you start sourdough baking, you have to start recording what you do. Take pictures, describe feelings, measure heights, touch with your finger. The rules that apply to yeast baking, where you touch your finger and when you touch the dough and it has to come back and your print of your finger has to remain softly there, and that with sourdough is not fully working the same time. With yeast, you have a different behavior of the dough when you have lactic acid bacteria. It's as such, I don't know what Jan Willem or Jan Hendrik or Jan Pieter van den Wittenboer, he must be from the Netherlands probably.
From Friesland.
From Friesland, voila. So it's North Netherlands.
Hello, Jan Pieter.
Fries. So it's difficult to determine and to give advice actually about sourdough. That's what makes me always a bit reluctant when I see people sharing methods and things to do. It's not valid for everyone, because someone can have a sourdough with a ratio of 1 yeast for 50 lactic acid bacteria for 100 lactic acid bacteria, which is described in literature as being the standard. But we've seen big deviations here. So very difficult to say. And one day your sourdough can contain a lot of yeasts, and 3 days later, the yeasts might have disappeared and it might be full of lactic acid bacteria. And the time you invest in the bulk might be, you might need 3 times more, or you will never reach that level of bulk fermentation anymore, because your sourdough is just become something completely different. That's the complexity. Making sourdough is very simple. Mixing flour and water. How difficult can it be? Everybody can do that. But then once starting to deal with that, it's like making children. Making a kid is easy. Everybody can do that. But having pleasure making them is already another thing. And then make it grow up. Go through all these phases with the maternity, and then the puberty and adolescence, and getting older and older and older. We evolve, and your sourdough behaves differently any moment of the year.
What some people like to do is they like to put a few ice cubes in their oven. And so does Jim. Jim likes to add a couple of ice cubes directly inside of his Dutch oven. And I wanted to know more about that.
I seem to have discovered early on, maybe when I guess it must have been when I first designed the prototype of the pan. I don't know why. I must have seen somebody else post about adding some steam. So you can add too much steam. You have to sort of, but depending on the hydration of your loaf, I cook a lot of lower hydration breads. I think they can use that extra little pop of steam that you can get from an ice cube. I've tried spraying, and some people love the spraying. For me, the spraying doesn't work so well, or I don't do it the right way or something. But the ice cube, the little extra steam from the ice cubes have always helped my loaves.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I would be curious because maybe this is also lowering the temperature inside of the Dutch oven a little bit, right? That could also be one of
Yeah,
the factors.
I think I saw that in something you sent me. And so there it goes back to, I really should put my barbecue. So I have one of those remote thermometers that I could probably just stick under my loaf of bread and track the temperature.
Yeah.
But I haven't done it yet. I'd like to do it. I'd like to do it.
The next question that I wanted to ask Carl was about changing the flavor of your sourdough starter, specifically changing the microorganisms of your sourdough starter. Is that possible? Can that happen when you use a different kind of flour?
If you feed it with a different kind of flour for a long time, little by little, you will change the properties and you might change the families. Yes, probably. We have done the tests for 10 days. We have never experimented in over 50 days. That we haven't done. This is still something we could do. We just need time and resources to do that. But this is stuff we would like to investigate, definitely.
Next up is sort of that thing that makes every sourdough perfect, blisters. If you get blisters on your crust, you have that additional amazing texture. It's very hard to achieve them and I still don't fully know why. But one thing I know is that Jim achieves this on a consistent basis. So I wanted to ask him, how does he get those blisters? What's the secret, in your opinion, to get blisters?
Wow, this blisters, honestly, the blisters are what made me Instagram famous. So those blisters appeared on my loaf the very first bake when I made a prototype of my pan. I'd never had a blister before, and none of the, if you remember, I made 10 pans, I sent out 6. None of those 6 people could get the blisters. Every single one of my loaves, and it's not as much anymore today, every single my loaves was blistery out of my prototype of the pan. I don't know the answer. I've seen lots of people try to experiment to get the blisters, but I think it had something to do with the steam. I don't put a lot of flour in my Banneton, so I use a linen lined Banneton, which I think helps. So I don't have to really flour my loaf almost at all. And so I think that helps. And then when I score it, some people, to get a nicer score, a fancy score, they'll rub some flour in it. So I don't do any of that. I do think a naked loaf is more likely to be blistery like that. So yeah, no flour.
And if I now look at this bread, then your crumb looks somewhat airy, right? Not too wild, but I would say it's more of an even crumb. How do you get to a crumb like this?
Practice.
Practice. Okay.
I haven't quite figured it out yet. I haven't really gone for some of those. Like, I almost don't really want a wild crumb. I'd like, as a baker, to know I could make a really wild crumb. But mostly I would just I'd like to, my goal is always just to learn how to control it. So if I wanted to make a wild crumb, so I do pat my loaf a little bit, because I think, especially when I give away loaves to people, they don't really want a wild crumb. Mostly it's not going to ooze out all over your plate.
True, yes. Especially with olive oil, for instance. That's a little frustrating sometimes.
so it's the big holes is more for us bakers, I think, than eaters, even though I'll take them any day.
Being the sourdough librarian, Carl knows a lot about different sourdough starters. And I wanted to ask him, what's the perfect sourdough starter to him? What are the properties that the sourdough starter should have? Which characteristics should a sourdough starter have for you? What are you looking at? Which characteristics should it have?
Okay, I'm going to give my personal opinion, but that is purely me. There's many other opinions. Seeing the variety of sourdoughs here, these are not all sourdoughs that are where I say, like, wow. Yeah, I'm not wowed by all these starters on a personal note about taste, about acidity, about the way they are. For me, my starter, at home I have 2 starters. One that is coming from Altamura that I collected there. I got it from a baker that when I visited Altamura back in 2013. And another one I created together with Martina Gönemann a couple of years ago, when she was writing a book about sourdough, a German writer. And one is more a whole wheat flour starter, and the other one is a durum wheat starter. Now, what I try to do with these starters is to keep the acidity low, because my wife and my kids don't like it when the bread is acid. I'm looking for a lot of fermentation power. So I keep these starters not liquid. They are like semi-stiff. Like you see a lot of sourdoughs here in my bag from Italy. They have this consistency. They are firm sourdoughs. Whenever you have a liquid sourdough, you just shout out to increase the level of acidity. When you keep your sourdough stiff, you reduce the production of lactic acids and you favorize the production of yeasts. So
that's super interesting.
for me, my starter, I prefer it firm, stiff, drier, not too liquid, because I'm just not fond of acidity.
So by adjusting the liquid, you can change the level of acidity that your starter is producing.
In a liquid starter, you have much more transportation of the starches. Yeah, the enzymatic activity is higher, so everything is accelerated, and it's just like a rave for the microorganisms that are in there. When you have a stiff sourdough, everything goes slower. The yeast has more oxygen in the beginning to protect itself, and so you favorize the yeasts in a stiff starter. The Italians, they all have these stiff starters because they don't like acidity in their bread.
It's super interesting that you mentioned this, because I was recently making a spontaneously fermented bread dough, where I would just make a starter which had very, very, very high hydration. I think it must have been maybe 500% or so. And without refreshing, I was able to build the starter in 3 or 4 days and then use that to bake a bread out of it. It was so much faster than the traditional method of using, 1-to-1 flour-water ratio.
But again, it depends on the type of flour you've used, because it's your flour that is containing the microorganisms. So you can try tomorrow with another flour that is coming from somewhere else, and you might have completely the opposite.
Some people are saying that their sourdough starter is a little bit too sour. The balance between lactic acid bacteria and yeast is a little bit off. So I wanted to know from Carl, what can you do to get more CO2 production, so to have more activity from the yeast of your sourdough?
So what I do when my starter has been in the fridge for a couple of weeks, let's say, I bake normally every weekend or every 2 weeks. But sometimes it happens that I'm abroad or I don't have time. And then I take my starter from the fridge and I feed it 3 times with 4 to maximum 6 hours in between. And I make it stiff, very hard, and I keep it in water. So the acids that are produced during the fermentation are diluted in the water, and because there's always the fight between the yeasts and the lactic acid bacteria. They fight for the same food, and at a certain moment they do with the white flag. They say, okay, now let's live in peace together. But depending on the conditions, you might if you keep your fermentation of your starter below 8 hours, you favorize the yeasts. It's after 8 hours that the balance between the yeasts and the lactic acid bacteria is like vulnerable. That's the moment where the lactic acid bacteria take over and become dominant and start acidifying more and more the sourdough starter, and your yeast starts to die. So you do not have any benefit from the yeasts when you use a starter that is older than 8 hours. So feed your starter 4 to 6 hours with a maximum of 8 hours, and you will increase tremendously the fermentation power. Keep it in water, which is the metodo piemontese. It's from Piemonte in Italy, where you keep your starter in water to get rid of the acidity. Now, don't keep it longer than a week without feeding, because otherwise it will be diluted in the water.
When you see the interwebs, you see people talking about stretch and folds, which they do while their dough is fermenting. It's always sort of like a magical thing. How many stretch and folds are you doing? When are you doing them? And I wanted to ask Jim about that. How many stretch and folds does he do them at all?
Lately I've been doing, I think that what the old way was called a stretch and fold, where you just take and you lift up and then over and you do all 4 sides. And now people do a lot of what they call the coil folds, where you kind of lift up in the middle and the bread the dough curls down underneath. So lately, I think over the last week or two, I've been doing probably 2 of the really big folds, then 1 to 2 to 3 of the small folds.
Towards the end, then the small folds.
So what's that?
Towards the end, the bulk fermentation, then the small folds, or
once I noticed, you know, if you really look at your dough, it starts to really kind of spread out in your container. As it stops spreading out so much, that's when I moved to the coil fold. So a little bit less pulling action on the coil, just sort of a gentle, more kind of folding it over to give it structure than to really pull it to kind of develop the gluten or give it structure. I'm not sure 100% what the pulling does.
One thing that you always read on the interwebs is how the different temperature changes the flavor of the final sourdough bread. And I wonder whether that's actually true or whether that's a myth. And that's exactly what I asked Carl.
Again, you don't know what kind of starter they are using. They might have a completely different starter than what you have. What we do know is that when you lower the temperature, now I don't know what these colder temperatures, what is it? Is it 20 degrees? Is it 15 degrees or is it 5 degrees?
5 degrees, I would say.
Yeast stops its activity when it's -2. So as long as you are above -2, your yeasts will produce gas, will produce alcohol and these esters. So the small flavor components that contribute to the flavor. Okay. On the other hand, the colder it is, the less active your lactic acid bacteria become. Temperatures below 20 degrees, they do not like. So when you go cold, you go definitely to favorize the yeasts and you develop what the yeast can develop as a contribution. We know that the colder it gets, the longer you have to ferment. The longer you ferment, the more flavor components you develop. So there is like this correlation, but it depends which kind of yeast is present in my starter.
That brings us to the end of this video, and I wanted to ask you, do you like this format? Should I invest more time in it? What could I improve? Please share it in the comments section. Thanks for watching, hope you learned something new, and as always, may the gluten be with you.